I've been sitting on this story for almost 2 years. Not because I didn't believe it, because I did, and I didn't know what to do with that. The two men who told it to me, Cody Farr and his cousin Del Farr, are not the kind of people who make things up for attention. Cody spent 11 years running a logging crew in the Ozarks. Del is the kind of man who measures twice and cuts once and doesn't open his mouth unless he has something worth saying. When I say I've spent 2 years turning this over, I've gone back to the area 3 times. I've looked at the records, I've read things I didn't expect to read, and I've come to a place where I don't think what happened to those two men in the Boston Mountains in October of 2019 can be explained away. Not by bear behavior, not by psychology, not by misidentification of anything known to science. They killed one. They're both clear about that. And what came after is the part of the story that neither of them can find a way to leave behind. So I'm going to tell you what they told me, the way they told me, and then I'm going to tell you what I found when I started pulling on the threads around it. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The Boston Mountains are not a mountain range in the way most people picture one. If you've never been to the Arkansas Ozarks, the terrain surprises you. This isn't the Rockies. There are no dramatic peaks breaking above the tree line. The Boston Mountains are the southern edge of the Ozark Plateau, a massive upland of dissected highlands that runs from northwest Arkansas down into eastern Oklahoma, and the Boston Range is the highest and most rugged section of all of it. Elevations run from about 1,200 feet in the valleys up to 2,500 feet at the ridges. The topography is deeply carved by rivers that cut through sandstone and shale, and the result is a landscape of narrow ridge crests, steep hollow walls, and dense canopy cover that blocks out the sky from below. The Ozark National Forest covers almost 1.2 million acres of this terrain, and significant portions of it are wilderness designated under the Wilderness Act, which means no roads, no mechanized equipment, no trails maintained to any standard. The Richland Creek Wilderness, the Leatherwood Wilderness, the Upper Buffalo Wilderness, which abuts the Ponca area where the Buffalo National River begins. These are places where you can walk for 2 or 3 days without crossing a maintained trail or seeing a road. Real isolation, the kind that swallows people quietly, the kind where your cell signal quits and doesn't come back and you stop expecting it to. I want to take a minute before we get into the encounter itself to explain why Cody Farr is the kind of witness worth paying attention to. Because when you hear a story like this, the first thing you do, if you're honest with yourself, is look at who's telling it. You ask what they know, what they've seen, what their frame of reference is for the things they claim happened. And Cody's frame of reference matters here. He grew up in Madison County, the county just east of Newton, in a farming family that ran cattle on ridgeland that had been in the family since the 1890s. He spent his childhood in the kind of terrain most people never see from the inside. Ridge timber, hollow bottoms, creek drainages that don't have names on any map. He knew what black bear looked like in all 4 seasons. He knew the difference between a bear track and a coyote track and a bobcat track and a large dog track. He could tell you the approximate age of a deer bed, from the depression it left in leaf litter and the warmth of the disturbed ground. He started running equipment at 16, helping a neighbor on a small timber operation on the east side of the county. And by the time he was 22, he had his own business. By the time he was 30, he had a reputation in northwest Arkansas as a careful, efficient operator who brought jobs in on time and left properties cleaner than he found them. 11 years of professional timber work in the Ozarks means 11 years of dawn to dusk days in dense forest. It means knowing what every animal in those hills sounds and smells and looks like. It means developing a calibrated, unsentimental understanding of what belongs in the woods and what doesn't. When Cody Farr tells me something was wrong with the northwest corner of that property from the first day he walked it, I take that seriously, because he is not a man who assigns wrongness to things carelessly. Del Farr is a different kind of person, and I want to be fair to that too. He's quieter than Cody, more private. He grew up in Rogers, Benton County, which is more suburban than the hill country where Cody came from, but he spent his adolescence hunting with his father on family land in Carroll County, and he did 2 tours with the Army, infantry, in places he won't talk about in detail. What the Army gave him, beyond the obvious, was a trained eye for environment and a tolerance for sustained discomfort, and a way of processing threat that doesn't produce panic. When Dell assesses a situation, he does it the way a man does who has been in situations where wrong assessment has real consequences. He's not jumpy. He's not dramatic. When Del Farr tells you something happened, it happened. Those are the two men at the center of this. Keep them in mind. Cody and Dell were working a private timber contract in the fall of 2019, a thinning operation on about 400 acres of private land that bordered the national forest south of the town of Boxley. Boxley is a small valley community in Newton County, Arkansas. The valley itself is well known among birders and wildlife photographers because of the resident flock of whooping cranes that winters there, the only established wild flock in that part of the country, and birders come from a long distance to see them in the early morning light on the valley floor. But the ridge systems surrounding that valley are a different world, heavily timbered, privately held for generations, accessed mostly by gated forest roads that locals don't advertise and don't put on any map you can find online. The contractor who hired Cody had worked that land for decades. He knew every hollow. He told Cody to be careful on the northwest corner of the tract, near where the property met the national forest boundary, because the terrain got steep and the soil was soft from a wet summer. He did not say anything else about the northwest corner. Cody told me later that he noticed a few things on their first day of pre-work scouting. He does pre-work scouting on every job. Before the equipment goes in, he walks the property on foot, checking access, identifying problem terrain, looking at stand composition, making notes about what the job is actually going to require versus what the contract says it requires. He's been doing this for 11 years, and the walk always tells him something the contract doesn't. The first thing he noticed on that walk was the birds. The property had good ambient bird activity on the south and east sections, the usual mix for an October Ozark ridgeline: woodpeckers, nuthatches, the occasional kingfisher over the creek, jays. Normal. But when he got to the northwest corner, within about 200 yards of where the property line met the national forest boundary, that activity dropped off entirely, not just reduced, gone. He stood in the timber in the northwest corner, and there was no bird sound at all. No movement in the canopy, no calls, nothing. He stood there for 5 minutes to make sure it wasn't a momentary lull, and it wasn't. The silence held. He also noticed the deer sign. He'd been reading deer sign in Ozark timber since he was 8 years old. The property had good deer pressure based on the rubs and scrapes he found on the southeast portion, fresh sign, a mature buck or two working the area, but the sign all pulled toward the valley side of the property. In the northwest corner, nothing. Not a single rub, not a track, not a bed. In healthy timber with deer pressure elsewhere on the property, that absence meant something was displacing them, something they'd learned to move away from. He pointed both things out to Dell when they met up at the cabin that evening. Dell walked the corner himself the following morning and confirmed it. They discussed the mountain lion possibility, which was the most rational explanation available to them at the time. Mountain lions have been in the Ozarks in scattered, unconfirmed numbers for years. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission tends to be cautious about confirming breeding populations, but there have been enough credible trail camera images and track casts over the past 2 decades to suggest that cats are present in low numbers in the more remote sections of the Ozark National Forest. A mountain lion in the northwest corner would explain bird absence and deer displacement. Cody said, yeah, maybe a cat. But he filed the information away in the category of things to keep an eye on, rather than things to dismiss, which is different from deciding it was a mountain lion and moving on. He's careful about that distinction. They were running a 2-man operation with a small feller buncher and a skidder. The work would take roughly 3 weeks if the weather held. The landowner had a hunting cabin on the property, a solid structure with a wood stove and a generator, and he'd offered it to Cody and Dell for the duration, rather than have them drive an hour each way from Harrison. They took it. The cabin sat on a cleared knoll on the east end of the property, about 900 yards from the national forest boundary. Good sightlines in every direction except west, where the timber pressed in close. A creek ran along the south side, maybe 200 feet from the cabin. Nothing dramatic, just a year-round flow over flat slabs of sandstone that made a sound you could hear from the porch on quiet evenings. There was an outdoor propane setup for the range, a covered porch with a couple of chairs, and a 2-track gravel road that ran 1.5 miles down to the county road. The kind of place that feels genuinely remote without being inaccessible. The kind of place where the quiet is real, not the acoustic illusion of a suburb at 3 in the morning, but the actual absence of human noise for miles in every direction. The first week and a half was normal work. Cold mornings, the feller buncher cutting designated stems, the skidder pulling log decks to the landing, Cody making marks and Dell running equipment, and both of them too tired by dark to do anything but eat and sleep. Cody told me he hadn't thought about the quiet northwest corner since the first day. Work has a way of narrowing your focus. He described the rhythm of a logging job to me once in a way I've thought about since. He said, when you're in it, the world contracts to the work. You stop thinking about anything except the timber in front of you, the efficiency of the cut, whether the skidder's having traction issues on the slope, whether the landing is positioned right for the haul. The forest stops being a place and becomes a problem you're working, which means that whatever is in the forest that isn't part of the problem you're working gets filtered out. You stop noticing the small things, the birds, the deer sign, the patterns of sound, because they are not relevant to what your hands are doing. He said, I've been in a lot of forests over 11 years. I've worked timber in 3 states. And in all that time, the moments that got my attention were the moments the work brain couldn't explain away. A sound that didn't fit. A pattern in the wildlife movement that was wrong. The northwest corner was like that from day one. The work brain kept telling me it was nothing. Just a soft ground corner with maybe a cat in the area. But the part of me that grew up in these hills knew it wasn't nothing. I just didn't have a name for what it was. The first week passed without incident, but not without a low-level unease that Cody said he couldn't fully account for at the time. He described it as the feeling you get when something about a job site is subtly off, but you can't put your finger on what it is. Not a feeling he could point to and document, just a background frequency that ran under the normal workday and made him more alert than the job usually required. He noticed, toward the end of the first week, that he'd started keeping track of where Puck was more often than he normally would on a job, checking on the dog during the workday. Not because anything had happened, just noticing.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Dell had brought his blue heeler, Puck, a 6-year-old male who'd been coming to job sites since he was 4 months old. Puck was not a nervous dog. He wasn't reactive to deer or raccoons or the noise of equipment. He'd sleep in the cab of the skidder on cold mornings with the engine running and never flinch. Cody described him as a good job site dog, which is a specific compliment in the logging world. A dog that stays out of the way, doesn't startle equipment operators, and lets you know with minimal fuss if something actually worth knowing about is happening. The kind of dog that has worked enough outdoor environments to have a calibrated understanding of what in any given landscape is worth reacting to. For the first 12 days, Puck was normal. He ate when he was supposed to eat, slept where he was supposed to sleep, came when he was called, stayed out of the way when the equipment was running. He sometimes went off on his own during breaks to investigate the tree line on the south side of the property, which was typical dog behavior on a rural job site. He didn't go toward the northwest corner. Cody noticed that. He'd been in the area, running parallel to the national forest boundary on a few occasions, but he always stopped well short of the northwest corner and came back. Cody told me later he'd registered this at the time as mildly noteworthy, but had let it go. Dogs read landscapes differently than people do. It didn't necessarily mean anything. On the evening of day 13, Puck stopped eating. Not in the way a dog stops eating when it's sick. He walked to his bowl, looked at it, and walked to the east side of the porch and lay down facing the timber. His ears were up, rotating slowly. He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He just lay there watching the tree line with a fixed, concentrated attention that Dell said he'd never seen on the dog before. Not the excited alertness of a dog that's spotted a squirrel, something more serious than that. Dell said it looked like the kind of attention a dog gives a person it's uncertain about. Assessment, not curiosity. Dell tried to get him to eat, picked up the bowl and put it next to him. Puck looked at the bowl and then looked back at the trees. They both let it go and went inside. Around 9 that night, Cody was at the kitchen table going over timber tallies, and Dell was on the couch reading when they heard Puck bark. Once, hard and sharp, and then silence. Cody went to the door and stepped onto the porch. Puck was standing now, every hair on his back raised in a full bristle from his neck to the base of his tail, staring north toward the national forest boundary. His bark had been a single warning note, not the territorial bark of a dog defending a space, not the excited bark of a dog that's found something interesting. The kind of bark you hear when a dog has decided something it's been watching has crossed a threshold. It was monitoring. Now he was quiet and shaking. Cody stood on the porch for a few minutes, listening. The creek ran, the generator hummed, the timber was dark, the tree line a ragged edge against the sky, and nothing moved in it. After a while, Puck came back to the door, and Cody let him in for the night, which he'd never done at a job site before. The dog lay at the foot of Dell's cot and didn't move until morning. Dell told me he slept badly that night, not because of any specific fear, more because Puck's behavior had activated something in him that he couldn't quite shut off. He lay on his cot and listened to the dark outside the cabin walls and heard nothing unusual, just the creak and the wind in the high canopy and the occasional creak of the wood stove as it cooled. But listening to the ordinary sounds with heightened attention is its own kind of restlessness, and he was awake more than he was asleep. The next day was a Friday. They were planning to take Saturday off, drive into Harrison for supplies, and come back Sunday. Normal rhythm for a 3-week job. Friday passed without incident on the surface. The birds were still thin in the northwest corner, and Cody made another mark in his head about it, but the equipment was running well and they were ahead of schedule. He didn't mention any of this to Dell because there wasn't anything concrete to mention. He could say the dog had acted strange. He could say the birds weren't right. Neither of those things was a report. Neither of them would do anything other than make Dell look at him sideways. What Cody was doing, without fully articulating it to himself, was waiting for something concrete, something with edges, something he could point at. The background unease he'd been carrying for almost 2 weeks was real, but it was formless, and formless things don't hold up in a conversation between two practical men who have a job to finish. That night, around 11:30, something woke Cody. He lay on his cot in the dark, listening, and his first thought was that the generator had shut down, or the wood stove had made an unusual noise, some mechanical thing with an ordinary explanation. The cabin was quiet, the generator was off, they shut it down by 10 most nights. And then he heard it. A sound from somewhere north of the cabin, maybe 300 or 400 yards, in the direction of the national forest line. He described it to me 3 times across 3 separate conversations, and each time the description was the same. A sustained vocalization, not a howl, deeper than a howl and more controlled, with a cadence that reminded him of something trying to form a word. Not a word, just the shape of one, the effort of it. Like the sound came from something with a chest and a diaphragm that weren't built for that frequency, and it was pushing through anyway. A sound that implied musculature and intention in the same moment. It carried, but it didn't echo off the ridges the way a coyote pack does, those sounds that bounce around the hollow walls and seem to multiply, or the way a great horned owl carries through cold air. This was directional, aimed, a beam of sound rather than a cloud of it. The sound lasted maybe 4 seconds and ended abruptly. Not a fade, not a trailing off. A stop, like a switch thrown. One moment it was there, and then it was gone, and the night was exactly as quiet as it had been before. And the specific quality of that absence was, Cody said, almost worse than the sound itself. Dell was awake by then, too. He'd heard it from his cot. Puck was pressed against the wall under Dell's cot and was not making a sound. They stayed like that in the dark for about 20 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them got up. They lay there in the separate dark of their own sides of the cabin and listened, and nothing else came. Eventually, Cody got up and checked the exterior light on the porch and looked at the tree line and saw nothing but the tree line and the amber wash of the porch light. He went back inside, and they didn't talk about it, just lay there until they fell back to sleep. In the morning, they got up and ate breakfast and went to work, and neither of them mentioned the night, which Cody told me later he found almost as strange as the sound itself. 2 men who'd both been awake at the same time, both heard the same thing, and by unspoken agreement, just let it pass. He said, "We both knew that saying it out loud was going to make it real in a way that neither of us was ready for yet." Saturday in Harrison, while Dell was at the hardware store and Cody was walking the grocery aisle, Cody looked up what large animals were documented in Newton County, Arkansas. He already knew the answer, but he looked anyway. White-tailed deer, black bear, coyote, bobcat, unconfirmed mountain lion. He watched bear vocalization videos on his phone in the cereal aisle. The deepest sounds he found were huffs and jaw pops, bluster sounds, short and reactive, the sounds of a bear making itself known or expressing agitation. Nothing sustained. Nothing with that directional quality. Nothing with that strange truncated ending. He looked up coyote howls and wolf howls for completeness. Neither of those matched either. The coyote sounds were too high, too chaotic. The wolf sounds were closer in the bass frequency, but wrong in the structure. Wolves trail off into silence where this sound had cut out cleanly. He put his phone in his pocket and went and found Dell in the fastener aisle, and they loaded the truck and drove back toward Newton County without talking about what he'd been looking up. Dell would have made fun of him, not meanly, just the way cousins do. And Cody didn't have anything to report yet anyway. He'd confirmed that what they'd heard didn't match any documented species. That wasn't a finding. That was just a gap. They drove back to the cabin Sunday afternoon, in weather that had turned cold and gray. A thin overcast that made the Ozark ridgelines look blue and remote, the kind of October sky that compresses the world into something small and enclosed. Puck, who normally jumped into the truck before the door was open, had to be lifted in. He sat between them on the bench seat the whole way back and did not look out the windows. When they turned off the county road onto the two-track to the cabin, Puck made a sound Dell had never heard him make before, a low whine that climbed in pitch and then just stayed there, continuous, while they drove the 1.5 miles through the timber to the cabin. Not an intermittent sound, not a response to anything visible, just a sustained note at the top of his register that didn't stop until Cody killed the engine. Then Puck went completely silent and sat on the bench seat and did not move toward the door. Cody and Dell looked at each other and didn't say anything. Dell got out first, and Puck followed eventually, but he stayed within a foot of Dell's legs the entire time they unloaded the truck, which was not how he normally operated on a job site. He kept his body oriented toward Dell rather than toward the environment around him, like he'd decided that what he needed to keep track of was the person, not the surroundings. The last week of the contract started Monday morning. By this point, Cody had privately made a decision. They were going to finish the job, they were going to get off the property, and he was not going to mention any of this to the landowner. He had maybe 8 days of work left. He could keep his head down for 8 days. The northwest corner was the last section to be worked. They had left it because of the soft ground, planning to come to it last when the forecast showed a drier stretch. Monday and Tuesday they worked the south end of the property without incident. Good productive days. The kind of days where the work goes clean and you get more done than you planned. Cody found himself in a better frame of mind by Tuesday evening. The sun had come out. The equipment was running well. The south section of the property was straightforward timber on firm ground. He started to think that the previous 2 weeks had been his imagination working overtime. A vocalization he couldn't identify. Some displacement patterns in the deer. A dog acting nervous. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't necessarily something either. You can spend 3 weeks in a remote piece of timber and convince yourself of patterns that aren't there. He'd seen it happen to other people. Wednesday morning, they moved the equipment to the northwest corner. The atmosphere changed immediately. Not dramatically, not in a way Cody could document. Just a tightening in the environment that he felt in his chest and in the way Puck moved when they got out of the truck. The dog stayed closer to the skidder than he usually did. Cody started making marks with his flagging tape and found himself working faster than normal, the way you move when some part of your nervous system has decided it wants the task done and your body in motion. Dell ran the feller buncher with his characteristic economy and precision. Neither of them said much. The feller buncher was working the designated stems along the property boundary, cutting to within about 50 feet of the National Forest line. Cody was on the ground making marks. Dell was in the machine. At around 10 in the morning, Dell stopped the feller buncher. He almost never did that mid-cut without a radio call first. The machine costs money by the hour, and Dell runs it with the focused efficiency of a man who understands that stopping costs something. Cody looked up from his work. Dell's cab window was down. Dell had his head tilted out the window, looking into the National Forest timber to the north. Cody walked over. "What's up?" he said. Dell pointed without saying anything. Cody looked where he was pointing. About 120 yards into the national forest timber, something was standing at the base of a large white oak, standing upright. Not moving. His first read was a person. The shape was vertical, bipedal, 2 arms. But the proportions were wrong for a person, and he picked that up within the first second of looking, before his brain had formed the word. Too tall. The arms hung too low, the wrist nearly reaching the midpoint of the thigh rather than the hip. The shoulders were too wide relative to the waist. And it was dark. Not dark the way clothing is dark the way fur is dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The surface matted in a way that made it harder to see the creature than the tree it was standing next to. Cody stood next to the feller buncher and looked at it. Dell looked at it. The thing at the oak tree looked back at them. He told me, and I keep coming back to this part, that the head was wrong. He knew what a bear looks like standing up. He'd seen black bears go upright before, had watched one stand next to a logging truck on a job in Carroll County to investigate the cab, and he knew the silhouette, the round-eared profile, the way the neck merges into the head without much definition. This wasn't that. The head was elongated horizontally, wide across the jaw, and the ears were visible above the skull, pointed, set wide apart. The ears of something that uses its hearing actively. The face was oriented forward toward them, and the eyes, 2 points of faint reflection in the morning shadow, were forward-facing. Predator eyes, not prey eyes. He knows the difference without needing to think about it, the way anyone who's spent time in the field knows it. Deer have eyes on the sides of their heads, set wide for maximum field of vision. The eyes of an animal that needs to watch all directions at once. Bears and mountain lions have eyes that face forward, the binocular vision of an animal that pursues things. Whatever was at that oak tree was looking at them the way a hunter looks at something, with both eyes on target, and that quality of attention was something Cody felt rather than analyzed. He said the stillness of it was the thing that got to him most in that first minute. Not its size, not the shape, not the face. The fact that it didn't move at all. An animal surprised at 120 yards in open timber either goes rigid in the first half second and then bolts, or it doesn't startle at all. And the second option means it knew you were there before you looked up. This thing had known. Cody's read, the one he sat with for 2 years afterward, is that it had been there before the feller buncher started that morning, before they arrived at the northwest corner. It had watched the machine working and watched Cody walking the boundary making his marks, and it had stayed visible at the oak tree, not hidden, not moving away. Present, at a distance it had chosen, doing what watchers do. That detail changes the character of the whole encounter, he told me. It's not a startled animal. It's not a predator working up the nerve to approach. It's something that had made a decision to be seen. It stood there for about 45 seconds. Then it turned, not spun, not startled, turned deliberately the way you'd turn away from something you'd finished looking at, and walked into the timber. Upright the whole time. The gait was wrong for a bear. Bears sway when they walk on their hind legs. The weight shifts side to side because their hips aren't structured for bipedal locomotion, and the movement looks effortful, unstable. This walked straight, heel-toe progression, the way a person walks, except each stride was too long, covering ground at a pace that got it out of sight in seconds, despite the apparent unhurried quality of the movement. The timber swallowed it, and it was gone. Dell put the window up and sat in the cab for a minute before he said anything. Then he said, "You saw that, right?" "Yeah," Cody said. "What was it?" Cody didn't answer him. He walked back to where he'd been marking and stood there for a while. He picked up his flagging tape. He stood there some more. He was looking at the spot where it had been standing, at the white oak it had been next to, and he was running a calculation in his head that he didn't want to run, but couldn't stop running. He walked to the oak later that afternoon, after Dell had shut the equipment down for the day and gone back to the cabin. He stood at the base of the tree and looked up. The bottom of the lowest branch was 14 feet off the ground. He's 6 feet tall. His arm above his head reaches about 7.5 feet. He stood on his toes and reached and couldn't come close to the lowest branch. The scratch marks started at about 9 feet and went up from there. Long, parallel furrows in the bark, 4 of them grouped together, deeply incised, the spacing suggesting the width of a hand rather than a paw. 4 fingers and a thumb, gripping the trunk at 9 feet off the ground. The depth of the marks was what stopped him. He kept putting his fingers into them, measuring the penetration, trying to reconcile what he was feeling with the hardness of the wood he was feeling it in. Post oak is one of the densest hardwoods in the Ozarks. You can't drive a knife into post oak bark without real effort. Whatever had made these marks had driven through the outer bark and into the cambium beneath in a motion that had apparently been casual, the way you'd score your fingernail through wet clay. He hadn't noticed the other marked trees until he started looking. 6 more within 20 feet of the white oak, all marked at the same height, all showing that same pale, slightly luminous exposure in the furrows where the wood was new and unsealed. In the afternoon light, sweeping his gaze from trunk to trunk, the pattern became visible, a line along the property boundary moving northeast, as if something had been walking the edge of its territory from inside the national forest, touching each tree as it passed. The regularity of it was the thing. Not random rubbing, not the chaotic marking of an agitated bear. Sequential. Every few yards, another tree, a border being defined, or refreshed, or reminded of. He went back before dawn the next morning, alone, with a flashlight. In artificial light, the marks read differently than they had in the afternoon, sharper, the wood inside the furrows showing that slight gloss of really fresh-cut timber, telling him these weren't old marks that happened to still be visible. Something had been at those trees recently as in within the last few days, possibly the last night. He found the tracks on his way back to the cabin, 3 of them preserved in a patch of soft clay at the edge of a small seep that seeped up along the national forest boundary just inside the fence line. Large. He put his size 11 work boot next to one, and the track extended past his boot by a significant margin and was noticeably wider through the ball. 5 toe impressions, distinct, with the second toe measurably longer than the first. Human feet don't work that way. The second toe being longer than the first is found in some populations, but not in the geometric way these impressions showed. The second toe substantially extended in a pattern that looked more structural than incidental. The heel impression was deep, a true heel strike consistent with a bipedal walker, putting weight down through the back of the foot. No claw impressions at the toe tips, no nail drag in the soft clay, which ruled out any digitigrade or semi-digitigrade animal. He photographed the tracks with his phone. He photographed the scratch marks on the oak. He photographed the line of marked trees along the boundary as best he could in the flashlight beam. Then he walked back to the cabin and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited for Dell to wake up. When Dell came out of the bedroom, Cody slid his phone across the table without saying anything. Dell sat down and looked at the photos. He went through them once. He went through them again. He put the phone down. Then he said, "What are we going to do?" Cody said, "We're going to finish the job. 3 more days. We finish, we leave, we don't go into the national forest, we don't go looking for it, we don't poke at anything." Dell said, "Okay." Then he said, "Do you think it knows we're here?" Cody looked at him for a second. He said, "Dell, I think it's known we were here since day 1. Dell took the phone and looked at the track photos one more time. He set the phone down again and picked up his coffee. They went back to work. I want to say something about that decision because it tells you something important about who these men are. They had 3 days of contract work left. Something had been watching their operation from the national forest for the better part of 2 weeks. Something large enough to leave tracks that extended past a size 11 boot. Something that had gripped trees at 9 feet off the ground and left marks in dense hardwood as if the wood were soft. They could have left. They had no contractual obligation that would have survived a reasonable conversation about unusual circumstances. But they stayed and they finished the job. And they did it quietly, without drama, without telling the landowner, without telling anyone. That's not bravado, that's professional identity. They had a contract and a reputation, and 11 years of Cody showing up and finishing what he started, and a handful of photographs on a phone wasn't going to change that. I've thought about that choice a lot. It says something about the men. It also raises the question of whether finishing was the right call, whether being on that property for 3 more days, and specifically working those 3 days in the section of the property closest to the national forest boundary, was the thing that escalated what came next. The last 2 days in the northwest corner were strange in the way that strange things become almost routine when they persist long enough. Puck stayed in the cab with Dell during equipment hours without being told to. He didn't even try to get out when they stopped. He just sat in the cab and waited. Cody saw movement twice on Wednesday afternoon in his peripheral vision, shapes shifting at the timber's edge about 90 yards out. the kind of movement you catch in the corner of your eye and lose when you turn to look directly. He didn't walk toward it. He didn't mention it to Dell. He made his marks and kept working. Thursday was the opposite problem. The timber was completely still all day. No peripheral movement, no sounds from the National Forest direction, nothing. The birds stayed absent in the northwest corner, which had been consistent, but there was an added quality to Thursday that was harder to name. A flatness. Everything on the surface was normal, but something underneath wasn't. And the absence of any evidence of the thing was, as Cody put it, in some ways worse than evidence of it. When you can't locate a threat, your nervous system assumes it's everywhere. Friday was the last full work day. By 4 in the afternoon, the last log deck was on the landing, the skidder was staged, and the feller buncher was ready for the Saturday morning haul. They walked back to the cabin in the early dark of late October, cold air dropping off the ridges, Cody doing the mental math on trailer loads and drive times, almost relaxed, almost. Then they heard it from the porch, not one vocalization, 2. Answering each other, call and response, from 2 different points north of the property. The first one was the same sound from 2 weeks ago, the one that had woken Cody on a Friday night, deep and sustained and directional. The second came from further west, shorter, lower at the end, almost a bark in its truncation, but not a bark in anything else about it. 2 of them, communicating across the property. They stood on the porch and listened, and neither of them spoke. The sounds didn't repeat. After maybe 3 minutes of silence, Dell went inside. Cody stayed on the porch and lit a flashlight and swept it across the edge of the clearing. He found prints in the soft earth at the edge of the cabin clearing, 60 yards from the porch, the same shape as the ones he'd found at the seep. Something had walked to the edge of the cabin, clearing within the last day or 2, and stood there, 60 yards from where they slept. He held the flashlight on those prints for a long time, and this was the moment, he told me, where the thing stopped being an observed phenomenon and became something personal. The northwest corner was 400 yards from the cabin. The National Forest boundary was 900 yards from where he was standing, and the prints were 60 yards away. Whatever had been watching their operation from the tree line for 2 weeks had come to the cabin. It had stood in the dark at the edge of their clearing, and the timing was specific. The prints weren't old. The ground at that spot would have shown earlier prints if they had been there longer. This had happened in the last night or 2. As the job wound down, as the equipment moved closer to the National Forest boundary, something had moved closer to the cabin. He stood on the porch in the dark for a long time. He pointed the light at the tree line. Nothing moved. He went inside and didn't sleep. That was Friday. Saturday was the last haul day. Saturday morning. Neither of them had slept much. Cody was up before 5, and the temperature had dropped overnight to around 29 degrees. A hard freeze on the windshield of the truck, frost on the grass of the clearing, the generator running cold and loud when he switched it on for heat. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the tree line in the gray pre-dawn light. The tree line looked back at him and was still. He loaded the truck with the last of their personal gear and checked the propane shutoff, and left a note for the landowner about the water line at the south corner of the property that had a slow seep he'd noticed. Dell came out at 5:30, and they loaded Puck into the cab. The dog climbed in without his usual energy, settling into the middle of the bench seat in the way he'd been doing all week. They drove down the 2-track to the county road and hitched the lowboy they'd staged there the night before. The first load was the skidder. They drove back up to the landing, hooked it up, drove it out, left the trailer at the county road. Cody drove Dell's truck back up alone for the second load. The second load was the feller buncher. He drove up through the timber, with the headlights moving through the trees and the shadows shifting, parked at the landing, got out into the cold. 29 degrees and still no wind, the frost on the log deck catching the truck lights, the creak audible from where he stood, the only sound in the woods. He hooked up the machine and went through his pre-haul check with the focused economy of a man who's done this 1,000 times. He was about to get in the truck when he saw it. At the edge of the timber, at the point where the National Forest line met the southeast corner of the landing. Standing in the open, not concealed, not at 90 yards, 40 feet from him. At 40 feet, detail resolves. 7 feet tall, minimum, covered in dark reddish-brown fur that was coarser and longer on the shoulders and neck, shorter on the face and hands. The hands were visible, hanging at its sides, and they were large with long fingers ending in dark curved nails. Not the hooked claws of a bear, but something closer to an enlarged fingernail, curved and dark. The face was lupine in its general structure, elongated through the jaw, with a pronounced brow ridge and ears that rose above the skull in points, forward-facing amber eyes catching the early light. In the cold of the landing, he could hear it breathing. Slow, deep, unhurried breaths, the steam coming up from its nostrils in soft curls that the truck's headlights caught and dissolved. The breathing of something that had been standing there a while. Cody did not run. He stood next to the truck and looked at it, and it looked at him, and the 40 feet between them was nothing, was a distance he could cross in 4 seconds, was a distance at which he could see the texture of the fur on its shoulders and the way its amber eyes tracked him without moving its head. He said his first thought, the involuntary one that arrived before anything else, was that it was tired. He didn't know why he thought that. Something in the quality of its posture, the way it held its shoulders, the evenness of its breathing. A creature that had been carrying something for a while. He didn't move. It didn't move. That lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then Dell's truck came back up the 2-track. Dell had gotten impatient at the county road and driven back up. His headlights swept the landing as he came around the last bend, and in that doubled light, Cody saw the creature fully for the first time without shadow. 7 feet of dark reddish-brown, the face turning toward the incoming headlights with those amber eyes catching the beams and throwing them back flat and white the way a deer's eyes throw back headlights, that flat-tapedal reflection. But this was not a deer. Dell stopped the truck. 30 seconds of silence, both of them looking at the same thing. Then Dell got out. He had his rifle behind the seat. He kept a .308 on job sites because they were in bear country. He told me later that he didn't decide to get out. He said his body was outside the truck before the decision happened, operating on something prior to thought. Cody yelled at him. Dell's name, and then get back in the truck, loud enough to carry across the landing. He wasn't thinking about provocation. He was thinking about the size of those hands and the 40 feet between them, and the fact that he didn't know what it was going to do. The creature, to this point, had not moved. Dell raised the rifle. Cody told me about what happened in the 2 seconds before the shot, and he's consistent across every telling. The creature looked at the rifle, then it looked at Dell's face, then it looked at Cody's face. 3 separate, deliberate movements of its gaze. Then something changed in its posture, its chin came down slightly, its shoulders squared, the specific physical adjustment of something bracing for impact while choosing not to retreat. Not an aggressive posture, not a threat display. Something that looks a lot more like resolution. Dell fired once, center mass. The shot hit. They're both certain of it. The creature staggered back 1 step, its left shoulder dropping, and then it turned and moved into the timber, fast. The way something badly hurt moves in the first seconds before the body calculates the damage. They heard it in the brush for about 10 seconds, the crashing of something heavy moving fast through dense undergrowth, and then the sound stopped. Cody walked to the tree line. He stopped at the edge. In the soft ground at the exact point where the creature had been standing were 2 deep prints, the same pattern as the tracks at the seep. He looked at the timber beyond them, at the gap between the trees where the sound had ended. No blood visible in the ground between the clearing and the tree line. A large animal can carry a chest wound without external bleeding for the first seconds, especially in cold that congeals blood quickly. But the absence meant he couldn't confirm from this side. He stood there for a moment and thought about going in. He looked at the timber, and what he saw was dark and dense and belonging entirely to whatever moved through it, and he made the only decision available to a man with any sense of proportion. He turned around and walked back to the truck. "Dell, we need to leave." Dell was still looking at the spot where it had gone in. He said, "Do you think it's dead?" Cody said, "It doesn't matter. We need to leave right now." Dell lowered the rifle. He looked at Cody. Something passed between them that Cody said he doesn't have the right word for. Not guilt exactly, not fear exactly. The specific hollow weight of having done something that can't be undone and knowing it immediately before there's been time to build any rationale around it. They loaded what was on the landing onto the second trailer and drove out. They did not go into the timber. They hitched the second load at the county road and drove toward Harrison without talking. Puck was sitting in the exact center of the bench seat when they got back to the truck, ears flat. He didn't move to greet them. Dell pulled over on the county road about halfway to Harrison, sat with the engine running for a few minutes. He told me later he didn't know why. He just sat there looking at the road and tried to put a name on what he'd shot, and he couldn't. And that was the part that bothered him most. He'd been hunting since he was 8 years old. He'd taken deer, bear, coyote, feral hog. He had a category for every animal he'd ever harvested. Whatever he'd shot on that landing didn't fit any of them, and the absence of a category was a specific kind of disorientation he hadn't expected. He told me. The other thing I kept coming back to, sitting there on the side of that road, was how it looked at me before I fired. It looked at the rifle, then my face, then Cody's face. 3 things, in sequence, deliberately. That's assessment. That's a being reading a situation and making a choice about it. And it chose to stand there. That's what I can't get past. It chose. He said, I've never had anything look at me that way in the moment before. Like it was making a decision about something that had nothing to do with whether I was dangerous. Like the question it was asking itself was a different question entirely. He never told me what he thought the question was. I didn't push. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. What came after is what neither of them can fully account for. And it's what I've spent 2 years trying to understand. Cody went back to Fayetteville. Dell went back to Rogers. They'd known each other their whole lives, worked together for 6 years, talked on the phone 2 or 3 times a week normally. In the 3 weeks after the Boston Mountains job, they barely talked. Cody called twice, and both times the conversation lasted a few minutes and felt like it was happening around something that neither of them would name. Cody told me he spent those 3 weeks in a limbo he couldn't quite define. He went back to work on other jobs, nothing in Newton County, timber work in Carroll County, a small operation in Benton County, routine stuff. And every time he drove a road through heavy forest, he found himself looking at the tree line with an attention he didn't recognize from 11 years of working in timber, not looking for wildlife sign, looking for whether something was watching from the edge of the light. He'd catch himself doing it at 60 miles an hour on the highway, scanning the tree line as he drove, and have to consciously redirect his attention back to the road. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't tell his logging contacts. He had a version of the story ready if anyone asked. Something about a big black bear acting aggressive near the equipment. Nothing unusual. Nobody asked. What kept coming back to him, he said, was the 10 seconds of sound in the timber after the shot. He'd been hoping, without quite letting himself think it directly, that the silence after those 10 seconds meant the creature had gone down quickly, that a 308 center mass had done what a 308 does. But 10 seconds in dense brush covers a lot of ground for something that size and moves at that speed. And silence after movement doesn't always mean what you want it to mean. It can mean an animal is down. It can mean an animal has stopped and is listening to what comes after. 3 weeks after the job, Dell called at 11:30 on a weeknight. Cody was already in bed and picked up half awake. Dell said, "Something's been outside my house." Dell lived on 5 acres outside Rogers in Benton County, backed up to a heavily wooded ridge. He'd lived there for 9 years. In those 9 years, he'd had the normal rural wildlife come through. Deer in the garden in summer, a raccoon that got into the trash every few weeks, a black bear in the fall that hit the trash cans twice before he secured them better. He knew what normal nocturnal animal presence sounded and felt like on his property. The sounds animals make moving through his yard in the dark, the footfalls, the disturbance of the brush, the way Puck would stir and then settle when it was something ordinary. He knew the register. This wasn't that. 3 nights in a row, Puck had gone to the back door at roughly the same time, between 11 and 1, and stood there, not barking, not whining, just standing with his face pressed toward the door, shaking. A dog who had never in 6 years given that specific response to anything. Cody asked, "Did you go out and look?" Dell said, "Second night I did. Found tracks along the back fence line, same shape as the ones at the job site." Cody was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dell, those tracks were 60 miles from your house. I know." They sat with that on the phone for a while. Then Dell said, "You think it's the same one?" Cody said he didn't know. What he was thinking but not saying was the calculation he'd been trying not to run. If it was the one Dell had shot, it hadn't died in the timber. And if it hadn't died in the timber and it hadn't died in the weeks after, then something had tracked Dell across 75 miles of mixed forest, agricultural land, small towns, and county roads, from a private timber tract in Newton County to a 5-acre property in Benton County, had located his specific property, had come to his back fence line. He didn't say it. He said, "Keep Puck inside. Don't go out after dark. Don't go up the ridge behind your property. Call me if anything changes." 4 days later, at 2 in the afternoon, Del called again. "Cody, I need you to come up here." Cody drove to Rogers the next morning. What Del showed him is the thing I find myself returning to again and again when I try to understand the full shape of what happened in 2019 and after, because it's the piece that shifts the story's category. Along the back fence line of Del's property, every wooden fence post on the north-facing section had been scored. Same type of marks as the trees at the job site. 4 parallel furrows in the cedar posts, deep, grouped, the spacing of a hand. They started at the northernmost post on the east side and ran sequentially, post by post, all the way to the southernmost post on the west side. Only the posts facing the timber to the north, 11 posts, 11 separate sets of marks, each made in the same stroke pattern, top to bottom, 4 furrows. Cody ran his fingers along the furrows on the nearest post. The depth matched, the spacing matched. He looked at the line of marked posts running along the fence, and then looked up at the ridgeline above Del's property and said nothing for a while. It removed the last possibility of coincidence, he told me later. One set of unusual marks in Newton County is unexplained. The same marks, identical in structure and depth, on a fence line 75 miles north on the property of the man who fired the shot, is a different kind of fact entirely. It's not 2 animals producing similar marks in similar locations by accident. It's the same agency or the same kind of agency, finding the same person in a different location and doing the same thing. Del watched him. He said, "Do you think it followed me?" Cody said, "I don't know how else to read this." Puck sat on the back porch and watched the ridge above them and would not come to the fence no matter how many times Del called. Cody stood at the fence with the timber on the ridge pressing down toward him and felt something he said he'd never felt before in the woods. Not the ambient watchfulness of being in wild country. Not the awareness that predators exist, but the specific directional awareness of being observed by something that already knew who he was. Not what he was. Who. He said, "I've been watched by deer, bears, probably cats over the years. Animals assessing whether I'm a threat or something to avoid. This was different. This felt like being observed by something that had already made up its mind about me and was just letting me know it knew where Del lived. Del wanted to know what to do." Cody told him, motion cameras on the back fence line, Puck inside at night. No going up the ridge, no going out after midnight. He drove back to Fayetteville and lay in bed looking at the ceiling. 2 weeks later, he called me. That's how this started. I want to tell you about what the cameras captured before I get into the history of the Boston Mountains and the Book of Enoch, because the camera images are the one piece of this that exists as physical evidence beyond testimony, and they matter to how I've thought about everything that follows. Del put up 4 Browning Strike Force trail cameras on the back fence line, triggered by motion, standard 940 and Nobit's infrared. He set them up on a Wednesday. By Friday night, 2 of them had images. The images are not clear. I've seen them, Del sent them to me, and I've had them looked at by 2 separate people. One who does professional wildlife photography and has spent years in the field calibrating what he sees against what he knows, and one who spent years in photographic analysis doing work he can't fully describe, but which amounts to determining whether what's in an image matches what was actually in front of the camera. Both said the same thing. The images are not manipulated. What's in the images was in front of the cameras. The first image shows a large upright figure at the fence line, caught mid-stride, facing the camera. The infrared makes its eyes reflect white, the tapetal reflection that shows up in night camera images of animals. The proportions are wrong for a human. The shoulder width is too great relative to the hip width. The ears are visible above the skull. The second image was taken 37 seconds later. The figure is facing away from the camera, moving toward the ridge. It's walking upright. Del measured the fence post spacing and the stride length visible in the second image. The distance between where the right foot hit the ground and where it hit again is approximately 5 feet. A human walking pace produces a stride of about 2.5 feet. A tall man running produces 4 to 4.5 feet. What's in that image was walking at 5 feet per stride. The wildlife photographer I had look at the images called My Attention to Something in the first image I had missed. The fur along the upper left shoulder and chest of the figure shows a disruption pattern, an area where the coat lies differently than the surrounding fur, matted and irregular in a way that's asymmetric with the right side. He said it was the kind of asymmetry you see in animal images when there's an injury beneath the coat. He was careful to say he couldn't be certain from the image quality, but the location of that disruption, left side, chest height, is consistent with what a .3-8 exit wound site would look like on a large animal 6 weeks after the injury. Dell sent the images to Cody. Cody looked at them and sent back 2 words, "I know." The cameras triggered 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Always the north fence line, always between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. Always alone, a single figure, moving toward the timber at the end of each visit, never toward the house, making its presence known and then going back up the ridge. Dell told me that the most unsettling quality of those 6 weeks was not fear. He said he kept expecting fear, the acute kind, the kind that makes you do something, and it didn't quite arrive. What came instead was a feeling he kept describing to me as obligation, like something was owed, like he was on a payment schedule he hadn't agreed to and couldn't get off. He said, "I knew when I pulled the trigger it wasn't right. Even in the moment before the shot, I knew. And now something is at my fence every few nights and I don't know what it wants and I can't ask it and I can't give it anything. And that's the part I can't leave alone. The not being able to give it anything." He paused. Then, "If it wanted to hurt me, it would have come to the house. My back door is 60 yards from that fence. If it wanted to come through the door, it would have come through the door. It hasn't. It just comes to the fence, and it marks the posts, and it leaves. And I don't know if that's patience or something else entirely." He described the nights when it was there as having a specific quality distinct from other nights. Not louder, quieter. The neighborhood sounds, distant dogs, the occasional vehicle on the county road were still present. But Puck would be at the back door, and Dell would be awake in the particular way you're awake when your body knows something before you do. And the silence outside the back windows would have a weight to it that normal silence doesn't have. He compared it to the specific quality of air before a tornado, when pressure drops and birds stop, and the silence goes from absence of sound to presence of something else. His body picked it up before he checked the cameras. He started going to bed earlier on those nights and lying there waiting for the quality to arrive, because the waiting was the only thing he could offer. The fence markings stopped after about 6 weeks. No images, no new marks on the posts. Dell waited a week, then another, then called Cody. Cody said, "Okay." Dell said, "Do you think it's over?" Cody said, "I don't know." Dell said, "Do you think it found what it was looking for?" And Cody said, "Dell, I don't know what it was looking for." I've thought about that exchange more than almost anything else in this case. The explanations for why it stopped are limited. It moved on. It decided whatever it needed to decide. Or the wound that Dell put in it on that landing, the wound visible in the trail camera image as an asymmetric disruption of fur on the left chest, finally completed its work 6 weeks after the shot was fired. A .308 round in the chest of an animal that size would cause internal damage that compounds over time, infection, fluid accumulation, progressive systemic collapse. An animal tough enough to walk out of a clearing after taking that shot could still die from it 6 weeks later. And if what came to Dell's fence line was the same animal, still carrying that wound across its weeks of marking and leaving and marking again, the timeline is consistent with that outcome. I don't know, nobody does. What I do know is that neither of them has been back to the Boston Mountains. Cody has turned down 2 contracts in Newton County since 2019. He told me flatly that he'd work anywhere in the state except that corner of the Ozarks. No drama in the way he said it, just a statement of his business practice. Dell sold his Rogers property in the spring of 2021 and moved closer to town. He didn't explain the sale to most people. Now, let me tell you what I found when I started looking at the history of the Boston Mountains, because what happened to Cody and Dell in 2019 is not the first time something like it has been documented in that country. And then I want to tell you about the Book of Enoch, because what the oldest written record of beings that match this description says about them includes something specific about how they respond to being harmed. And when I found that passage, it reframed everything I thought I understood about the 6 weeks at Dell's fence line. The Ozarks have a documentary record of encounters with large upright beings going back to the earliest period of Euro-American settlement. In the 1840s and 1850s, as settlers moved into the hill country of northwest Arkansas and northeast Oklahoma. There are accounts in county histories and church records of encounters with large, upright, fur-covered figures in the hollow country, along the Buffalo River, the Kings River, and the Illinois Bayou drainage. The language varies: wild man, forest giant, great hairy man, but the physical description is consistent across accounts that couldn't have been coordinated. Upright posture, extreme height, dark fur, forward-facing eyes, a face that was neither ape-like nor entirely human. Witnesses who had seen bears consistently said what they saw was not a bear. One account from a hunting journal I found in the University of Arkansas, Special Collections in Fayetteville, written around 1873 by a man named Elias Dunbar, who ranged the country north of Mulberry Creek in Franklin County, which borders Newton County to the south, describes an encounter in detail. Dunbar was running hounds on deer in the ridge timber above the creek when the dogs went suddenly silent and then came back to him cowering, which he says he found inexplicable because these were experienced hunting hounds that had never broken like that. He followed up the hollow on foot and found, on a sandstone shelf above the creek, a series of tracks he described as man tracks, but too long and the toes wrong. He measured one against his rifle stock, which he notes was 32 inches long, and the track exceeded the length of the rifle stock. Dunbar doesn't offer an explanation. He sketches the track in the margin of the journal page and writes, "I came away from there at a faster pace than I arrived." The journal is a standard hunter's log, laconic, practical, mostly about game counts and weather. The entry before the sandstone shelf is about a doe he took near a salt lick. The entry after is about the condition of the trail above the creek. The sandstone shelf entry stands out because the handwriting changes, tighter, more controlled. Not the shaking hand of panic, but the careful lettering of a man choosing his words with more attention than he normally applies to a field journal. He writes it the way a person writes who isn't sure how much to put down and is erring on the side of less. He saw something else at that shelf. He didn't write it down. He wrote the tracks because tracks are evidence. Whatever he saw was something he couldn't call evidence, so he left it out and just said, he left fast. The sketch in the margin shows a footprint longer than a size 12 human foot, wide through the ball, with the second toe extending substantially beyond the first. The same proportions as the tracks Cody photographed at the Seep in 2019. 146 years between the two records of the same foot in the same mountain system. In the Franklin County Historical Society, Archives in Ozark, Arkansas, a collection of early settler correspondence assembled by a local historian in the 1970s, contains two more relevant letters. One from 1891, a woman named Clara Hess writing to her sister in Illinois. Her husband came home 2 days early from a hunting trip north of Ozark, and wouldn't say much about why, except that he'd found sign of something large that walked upright, and the dogs wouldn't follow the track. She writes, "He says it was not a bear, and I believe him, as he has hunted bears in Kentucky before we moved here and knows the difference." And a letter from 1908, a man named August Birdsong, writing to a business partner in Fort Smith about selling a timber tract he'd intended to develop in Johnson County, which is directly adjacent to Newton County. After going to look at the land, he'd encountered something that persuaded him the land was not one he wished to work. He doesn't describe the encounter. He says only that what he saw in the timber in the late afternoon convinced him there were things on that ridge that people were not meant to interfere with. He sold the land at a loss and doesn't explain further. That's more than 150 years of documented accounts in the same mountain system, same terrain, same track pattern, same behavioral signature, the watching from distance rather than attacking, the displacement of other wildlife, the dogs refusing to follow the sign, the witnesses choosing to leave without explanation. And in all of that record, nobody describes what happens when you don't leave. Nobody in those 150 years of accounts describes what happens when you fire a shot. That's the new variable that Cody and Dell introduced. And that's where the Book of Enoch becomes directly relevant in a way I didn't anticipate when I first started reading it. The Book of Enoch is not a fringe text and not a modern invention. The earliest Aramaic fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, which dates the composition of the core material to somewhere between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. It is canonical scripture in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest continuously operating Christian institutions on earth. where it has been preserved in the ancient Ge'ez language and used in liturgy for over 1,600 years. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first analyzed after their discovery beginning in 1947, multiple fragments of the Book of Enoch were found among them, including sections of the Aramaic text that predated any previously known copies. Whatever you believe about the theological nature of the text, its antiquity and the continuity of its manuscript tradition are not points of dispute among scholars. The first major section of Vern Enos is called the Book of the Watchers and runs from chapters 1 through 36. It tells a story that anyone familiar with Genesis 6 will recognize in compressed form. Divine beings called the Watchers descended to earth, formed unions with human women, and produced offspring. In Genesis, the account is 2 verses long. In Vern Enoch, it runs for several chapters, and the detail is extensive. Chapter 6 names the Watchers and their leaders. Chapter 7 describes the offspring. They were giants, the text says, and gives a height that is clearly symbolic rather than literal, a way of communicating impossible size. But the description continues into detail that's less symbolic. The giants consumed everything men produced. When men could no longer sustain them, they turned on men and on other forms of life. Chapter 7, verse 5 in most translations. They began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. Scholars have interpreted this passage various ways. The most common reading is an ecological catastrophe, the giants consuming wildlife unsustainably. But there's another reading that several ancient Jewish commentaries support, which is that the verse describes interbreeding, a second generation of crossings that produce beings of mixed lineage from the Watchers on one side and animal kind on the other, hybrid beings. Beings that carried the size and cognition of the Watcher line, combined with the physical characteristics of animal life. The Book of Giants, fragments of which were found at Qumran alongside the Enoch material, and which scholars believe may predate the canonical 1 Enoch text, describes specific named Nephilim, with forms combining features of different orders of life. One fragment describes a being bearing the appearance of a man, combined with the aspect of a beast, upright in posture, covered in darkness. Another fragment describes a Nephilim whose form shifts between states, sometimes more man, sometimes more beast. There's a passage in chapter 15 of Vern Enoch that I want to sit with for a moment, because it's the passage that reframed the 6 weeks at Dell's fence line for me. The passage contains an address delivered through Enoch to the imprisoned Watchers. It includes this: "The giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth." The phrase is, do battle, not react, not respond. Do battle as a deliberate, organized collective action. The text is not describing individual monsters reacting individually to individual threats. It's describing a group with the internal coordination to respond to harm as a unit, to make war together, to sustain organized action over time. That implies communication between members of the group. It implies shared knowledge of what has been done to one of them. It implies that when one of them is harmed, the others know and have a capacity to act on that knowledge together. This is exactly what the behavioral pattern after the Boston Mountains suggests. The call and response vocalizations on the last Friday night of the job, 2 voices communicating from different positions north of the property, was coordination. And when Dell drove out of Newton County with a 308 rounds worth of damage in the timber behind him, the thing that found his property in Rogers 75 miles away was responding to information. It hadn't been on the landing when Dell fired, but it knew. There's additional relevant material in the Testament of Solomon, a Second Temple period Jewish text that describes interactions between King Solomon and various supernatural beings. One passage describes beings of mixed divine and animal form that withdrew from human habitation into wilderness territories and established what the text calls dominions, defined geographic ranges that they maintained collectively over long periods. The text describes these beings as possessing knowledge of human intention and human communication, knowledge acquired through sustained proximity and observation. It describes them as responding to encroachment on their dominions, not with immediate violence, but with demonstrations of awareness, making their presence known at the boundaries of the human spaces adjacent to their territory. That's the fence markings. That's exactly what happened at Dell's property in Rogers. Something came to the boundary, marked it, made its awareness known, did this repeatedly over 6 weeks, never came to the house, never engaged directly, demonstrated knowledge, and then withdrew. The Testament of Solomon says, these beings respond to harm done to one of their number, with what it calls a corporate grievance, a collective response that is proportional rather than immediately lethal. It says the response continues until the corporate grievance is satisfied, or until the harmed party's condition resolves the matter. That's a surprisingly specific description of 6 weeks of fence markings that stopped. I want to be careful about what I'm claiming here. I'm not arguing that the creatures in the Boston Mountains are the direct biological descendants of the Nephilim in a literal genealogical sense. I'm pointing out that a collection of ancient texts with documented manuscript traditions going back over 2,000 years consistently describes a class of beings with physical and behavioral characteristics that match what has been reported in the Boston Mountains for 150 years, and what Cody and Dell documented in 2019. The physical characteristics match. Enormous size, bipedal posture, fur, or described as covered in darkness, forward-facing eyes, forward-facing intelligence. The behavioral characteristics match. Territorial, watching, withdrawing rather than attacking, operating collectively. And the response to harm matches. Organized, sustained, bounded, stopping when some internal condition is met. The convergence across texts that had no communication with each other, across time spans measured in centuries, across cultures from ancient Judea to pre-contact North America to 19th century Ozark settlers, is the thing I find hardest to set aside. The indigenous record in the Ozarks reinforces this. Before European contact, the Boston Mountains and the surrounding plateau were inhabited continuously for at least 10,000 years, with evidence of Paleo-Indian presence going back to the end of the Pleistocene. The Bluff Dwellers culture, which archaeologists also call the Ozark Bluff Dwellers, occupied rock shelters along the Buffalo and White River drainages from roughly 2000 BCE through the early contact period. Their shelters survive because of the dry cave conditions in the Ozark Bluffs. The locations of those shelters show a consistent spatial pattern. South-facing ledges, sightlines to the valley floors, clustered near water on the accessible side. The north-facing hollow country, the deep timber systems running up toward the higher ridges, shows almost no evidence of sustained occupation. People came through. They hunted. They didn't stay. That pattern of systematic avoidance maintained over thousands of years doesn't arise from nothing. It arises from accumulated experience of what happens to people who do stay. The Osage Nation, which controlled the northern Ozarks at contact, describes beings they called the Little People and the Forest Giants in their oral tradition. The forest giants were described as neither hostile nor benevolent, but as possessing knowledge of the land and of human behavior that exceeded human understanding, and as maintaining territories in the deep forest that were not entered in certain seasons. The Caddo, who controlled the southern Ozarks and the Arkansas River Valley, have accounts of large forest beings associated with specific geographic territories that community members avoided under certain conditions. The Caddo framing is important. These weren't seen as simply dangerous places. They were places that belonged to something else, on terms that predated any living memory, and that required acknowledgement rather than defiance. A retired Forest Service district ranger who spent 20 years in the Ozark National Forest confirmed for me, off the record, that he'd received approximately 6 reports over his career from backcountry hikers in the wilderness areas, describing a large upright figure at distance, dark-colored, moving away through dense timber. He logged them as unverified wildlife encounters, which is standard for reports with no physical evidence. He said he'd never been able to match any of them to a documented species, and had never had an explanation he was satisfied with. 6 reports in 20 years from a single district sounds small, but the Richland Creek Wilderness and the Upper Buffalo Wilderness together cover about 14,000 acres of terrain that almost nobody enters systematically. There are no maintained trails in most of those acres, no ranger presence beyond occasional patrol. The number of encounters that go unreported because witnesses don't know who to tell or don't want to be on the record is genuinely unknown. But 6 formally logged reports from 2 wilderness areas of that size probably represents a fraction of what's been seen. The elk displacement pattern I mentioned earlier bears on this too. The elk herd reintroduced to the Buffalo River watershed by the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission in the late 1990s has established well, and now numbers in the hundreds. They concentrate heavily in the Boxley Valley and on the south-facing ridges. In the deep, hollow country north of the river corridor, bordering the upper Buffalo Wilderness and the national forest land running toward the Missouri border, elk are essentially absent from terrain that should support them. Game cameras placed by hunters and researchers in those hollows show deer and bear at normal densities. Elk are not present. Biologists at the Game and Fish Regional Office in Harrison told me the pattern was notable and without a clear explanation in terms of habitat quality or food availability. Wildlife displacement without a documented predator is one of the most consistent behavioral indicators associated with territory being held by something that prey animals have learned to avoid over generations. The elk in those hollows know something's in there. The deer pull south. The dogs refuse to follow the track. Every record from 1873 to 2019 says some version of the same thing. Now, let me tell you about the 3 times I went back to the Boston Mountains, because what I found there is the piece of this that I carry around most consistently. The first time was the spring of 2021, about 16 months after the job. I drove into Boxley Valley from the east, off Highway 21, and the valley hit me the way the Arkansas uplands often hit people who haven't been there before. Smaller and more enclosed than you'd expect from the map, with the ridges rising steeply on both sides and the bottomland narrow between them. The whooping cranes that winter in the valley had mostly gone north by late spring, but a few elk were visible in the bottomland near the creek, and the valley had the quiet, unhurried quality of a place that gets a modest amount of tourism and isn't entirely comfortable with it. I spent that first visit mostly on the ground level, driving the county roads, walking the maintained trail sections along the Buffalo River at Steel Creek, talking to people at the ranger station in Jasper, getting a physical understanding of what the terrain actually is. I talked to a retired wildlife biologist doing campground host shifts at Steel Creek, who had spent 30 years with Arkansas Game and Fish. I asked him, without any leading framing, whether he'd seen anything in the area that surprised him or didn't fit his prior expectations. He gave me a long, considered answer about unusual bobcat ranging behavior, and then mentioned, as an afterthought, that he'd heard from 2 separate groups of backcountry hikers in 2 different years about encounters in the Lost Valley area near Ponca. Large upright figure in the timber, seen briefly. He'd noted both reports, gone to look, found nothing, said the leaf litter in the dry season was too disturbed for substrate impressions. He told me this plainly, without embarrassment, the way professionals share data points that don't fit any category. He wasn't claiming anything. He was noting what he'd been told. The second visit was in the fall of 2021. I had arranged with the landowner, who was polite but clearly not interested in a long conversation about what had happened on his property, to walk the boundary of the timber tract. He stayed at the cabin. I walked alone. The northwest corner in October 2021 was 2 years past the logging job. The designated stems were gone. The landing was chest high in pokeweed and sumac and blackberry thicket. The opportunistic growth that moves into disturbed ground in the Ozarks with impressive speed. 2 years of growth had softened everything. The log deck was gone. The skidder ruts were grown over. The 2-track from the cabin to the landing was visibly narrower from encroaching brush on both sides. You could still see where the equipment had been if you knew what to look for. But it was becoming the forests again. I stood at the northwest corner for a while. October afternoon, cold, around 48 degrees. A gray sky moving cloud cover through the high canopy. The birds were working in the regenerating brush behind me on the landing site. Normal bird activity, the kind you'd expect in disturbed growth in fall, but the national forest timber ahead of me was quiet. The same quality of quiet that Cody had described from the first day he walked the property. About 60 feet inside the national forest line, at the base of a large post oak, I found scratch marks in the bark. 4 parallel furrows, starting at approximately 9 feet off the ground, deep into the cambium. The exposed wood inside the furrows was pale, showing the slight gloss of relatively recent damage, bark that had been open to the air for weeks or months rather than years. The marks had not been there in 2019. The post oak is 60 feet inside the National Forest line, which means it's 60 feet into terrain that nobody with any sense was accessing. But something had. Something had gripped that tree at 9 feet off the ground in the same manner, with the same 4-furrow pattern as the marks on the white oak that Cody had photographed 2 years earlier. I stood at that tree for a long time. I looked at the marks and looked at the timber behind them and thought about what the continuity of those marks across 2 years means. The logging job happened. Dell fired a shot. Something came to Dell's fence line in Rogers for 6 weeks and then stopped. 2 years passed. And on a post oak 60 feet inside the National Forest line, in the same corner of the same property, the same kind of marks were there, not a relic, not a remnant. Something had been at that tree recently. Something was still using that territory. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I've been telling this story in a fairly analytical register, and I think the analysis can obscure something real. Standing at that post oak in October 2021 was not the experience of a researcher confirming a data point. It was closer to what Dell described in those 6 weeks at his fence line, a specific weight, an awareness of scale that doesn't fit comfortably into language. The logging job was 2 years gone. Cody and Dell had moved on with their lives, different jobs, different properties. The land was absorbing the record of their presence the way land absorbs everything. 2 years, and it was almost as if they'd never been there, except 60 feet inside the National Forest line. On a tree that was old before either of them was born, the marks were there and were not old. Something in that forest was still doing what it had been doing before the job started, and what it would keep doing after anyone who read this account was gone. It doesn't need us to know about it. It doesn't need our documentation or our explanations or our frameworks for what it is. It has been existing in that territory for a long time, and the existence continues on its own terms. I photographed the marks. I looked at the timber beyond them for a long time. Nothing moved. I walked back to the cabin knoll and drove out to the county road and sat in the car for a while before I started the engine. The third visit was in the spring of 2023, and I'll come back to what I found then in a moment. But first I want to tell you what Cody and Dell said to me when I told them about the Enoch material, because their responses are the thing I think about most. I told Cody about the Book of the Watchers in our second conversation, after I'd spent 4 months in the research. I walked him through the core passages, the Watchers descending, the offspring, the hybrid generations, the physical descriptions, the behavioral profile in the text, the corporate response to harm. He listened without interrupting, which is how he listens to everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you think it's something from that old?" I said I thought the pattern in the text matched the pattern in the field in ways that were hard to ignore. He nodded slowly. He said, "That would explain what I saw in its eyes, on the landing. Not just intelligence. Something that's been intelligence for a very long time. Something that's been watching us long enough to know things about us we don't know about ourselves." He paused. Then, "And if it's that old, it knew what the rifle was going to do. Dell thought it might not understand what a rifle does to something its size. But if these things have been around humans as long as your text says they have, they know what rifles do. They know what guns do. They've watched us use them on each other for hundreds of years. So why did it stand there?" I said. Cody said, "That's the question I can't get past. I think it made a decision to hold its ground, knowing what was going to happen. And I think it made that decision because of something behind it in the timber that it was more concerned about protecting than it was about its own safety." He said, "I think it chose its pack over itself." I told Dell about the Enoch material in a separate conversation later. He's harder to read than Cody. He listened to the same summary and asked a few specific questions about the text, about its origins, about how old the Qumran fragments actually are. The kind of questions a careful person asks when they're evaluating the reliability of a source. When I'd answered them, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "If it's been here that long, watching us, it knows how we mourn." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "It came to my fence line every few nights for 6 weeks. It didn't attack. It didn't destroy anything. It came to the boundary, and it made marks, and it left. If it's as intelligent as you're describing, if it understands humans the way something that's watched us for that long would understand us, then it knows what marking a boundary means to us. It knows what a repeated, measured, deliberate action at the edge of a space means. It was doing something for itself, that looked to us like a statement of knowledge. But I think it was also doing something for itself that looked like grieving. He looked out the window for a while. He said, "I think it came to my fence line, and it made its marks and it left. And it did that for 6 weeks. And then it stopped." And I think the reason it stopped is the same reason anyone stops doing the thing they do when they're grieving. Because eventually you have to. I sat with that for a long time after that conversation. The last thing Del said to me, at the end of our final meeting, was this: "I've mostly made my peace with what I did. I can't undo it, and what came after seems to be over, at least for now. What I can't fully settle is not knowing what it was, not knowing what I took from that pack, whether it was young or old, whether it had been in those mountains for a season or a century, whether any of the ones that are still up there remember it specifically, the way a person is remembered, or whether what I left behind in the timber just became an absence that the pack absorbed and moved around." He paused. He said, "The not knowing is the part I carry, not the fear, just the not knowing. I think that's honest. And I think it's the appropriate burden for anyone who makes the decision Del made on that landing in October 2019, whatever the circumstances, whatever the provocation, whatever the frame of reference he was working from in the moment. The not knowing is what you carry. The next time you drive through the Boston Mountains on Highway 21 between Boxley and Vender, or take the county roads above the Buffalo River corridor toward Ponca, look at the timber on the north-facing slopes. Old-growth post oak and white oak, canopy dense, the understory dark below the first 30 feet. Think about how much ground is in there that nobody has mapped thoroughly, that no agency systematically monitors, that no trail system accesses. Thousands of acres of terrain in the Richland Creek Wilderness and the Upper Buffalo Wilderness alone, and those are just the named wilderness sections. The National Forest extends much further in every direction. Think about what has been in that terrain for a long time. Think about Elias Dunbar in 1873, walking away from a sandstone shelf faster than he arrived, not writing down what he saw. Think about August Birdsong selling a timber tract at a loss, rather than go back to a ridge where something convinced him that interference was not wise. Think about Puck going silent and shaking at the foot of Del's cot, and the specific quality of silence that Del started going to bed early to wait for. Think about the post oak 60 feet inside the National Forest line, with marks that were not old when I found them in October 2021. Whatever is in those mountains has been there since before Newton County was a county, since before Arkansas was a state, since before any Europeans set foot on this continent. It watched the bluff dwellers occupy the south-facing ledges and leave the north-facing hollows alone. It watched the Caddo move through the Arkansas River Valley and establish the protocols of avoidance that their oral tradition preserves. It watched the first settlers come in with their hounds and their rifle stocks and their county histories, and it watched them leave faster than they arrived and not write down the part that made them want to leave. It watched 11 years of Cody Farr's timber operations across 3 states, and it watched 2 weeks of one specific job, and it decided, at the end of those 2 weeks, to step out of the timber and let itself be seen. And then a pair of headlights swept across a landing, and a rifle came out of a truck cab, and something made a choice that it understood the cost of, and the cost came due in the timber 10 seconds later. Whatever is in those mountains knows what we are. It has known for a very long time. It knows how we work, how we think, what our tools do, what our presence in a landscape means. It knows these things because watching is what it does, and it has had a very long time to do it, and we are not as difficult to understand as we like to think. The question that the Boston Mountains ask, that the marks on the post oak ask, that the 6 weeks at Del's fence line ask, is simpler and harder than any explanation I've been able to find. It's been here the whole time. What does that mean for how we move through its country? I don't have a clean answer. I don't think there is one. I think there's just the weight of what Cody and Del carried out of that clearing in Newton County in October 2019, and the marks still visible on the bark of a post oak 60 feet inside the National Forest line, and the particular silence that settles over the north-facing hollows above the Buffalo River when the light starts to go. Something made those marks. Something is still up there. And it knows this country in a way that goes down to the bedrock, in a way that was old when the first Paleo-Indian followed the retreating ice across the Ozark Plateau 10,000 years ago, in a way that will still be old when every record of this account has faded from every medium it was ever stored on. The Boston Mountains keep their own time. We were guests there for 3 weeks in October 2019, and we didn't behave like guests, and what followed was proportional and measured and eventually stopped. The next time, if there is a next time, I hope whoever is on that landing has the presence of mind that Cody had and not the reaction that Del had. Not because Del is a bad man, he's not. He made a split-second decision under conditions that would have stressed anyone's judgment, and he's been living with the weight of it ever since, which is what honest people do. But the thing at that tree line had been watching them for 2 weeks. It had come to the edge of the clearing and stood in the open and been seen. It had made a choice to be visible. It had braced for what it knew was coming. It let itself be shot. Think about what kind of being makes that choice. Think about what it was protecting. And when you drive through those mountains, on whatever road takes you through the Boston uplands at whatever hour, just remember that the silence in those north-facing hollows is not empty. It is occupied. It has been occupied for a very long time, and it is watching. There are things I haven't told you yet. Things that didn't fit into the clean chronological account of what Cody and Del experienced. Things that came out in the later conversations. The ones where the formal interview structure loosened and we were just two people talking at a kitchen table or over a phone line late at night. Those pieces matter, and I want to include them here because they add texture to the story that the bare chronology doesn't carry. The first thing Cody told me that didn't come up in the initial account was about the smell. He mentioned it almost incidentally in our third conversation, when I asked him to describe the northwest corner on the morning he walked it by flashlight before dawn. He said the marks on the trees were the obvious thing, the tracks at the seep were the obvious thing, but there was something else he hadn't thought to mention because he hadn't known how to describe it. A smell in the northwest corner that was distinct from the rest of the property. He worked through trying to describe it for a few minutes. He said it wasn't the smell you'd associate with deer or bear, both of which he knows well from years in the field. It wasn't the musky rank of a bear rub or the sweet grassy smell of a deer bed. It was something more complex. He said the closest comparison he could come up with was the smell of a large animal that had been somewhere recently, that specific warm organic presence that a body leaves in cold air. But underneath that was something else he couldn't name, something mineral, almost metallic, the way some cave systems smell, wet stone and old air, like the smell was coming from something that spent a lot of time in places humans don't go. He said he'd smelled it on 2 other occasions during the job, without recognizing it for what it was at the time. Once on the second Monday of the contract, when he was making marks near the northwest corner before the equipment arrived, and once on Wednesday evening of the final week, when he was shutting down for the day and walked through a section of the boundary he'd already cleared. In retrospect, he thinks both times the smell meant the creature was nearby, or had been there recently. I asked him if the smell was strong. He said, not strong, specific. The kind of thing you might miss if you weren't already paying attention. But once I knew what it was, I couldn't unknow it. I think now that the reason Puck was always more alert in the northwest corner than anywhere else on the property wasn't just that he was picking up visual or auditory cues. He was picking up that smell. Dogs can detect things at concentrations we can't even register. That detail matters to me because of what the field research literature on large primate detection says about olfactory evidence. There's a body of informal documentation in the Bigfoot and Dogman research community of a distinctive smell associated with encounters, described variously as sulfur, wet dog, decaying matter, and something animal musky but different from known large mammals. Cody's description, metallic mineral with a warm organic note, doesn't perfectly match any of those descriptions. But it's consistent with what you'd expect from an animal that occupies a very specific ecological niche in a very specific type of terrain. Dense timber on a sandstone and shale substrate, where the ground moisture and the rock and the cave systems running through the limestone country to the north would all contribute to a distinctive chemical environment that an animal living in that terrain would carry with it. I'm not drawing a firm conclusion from that. I'm noting the consistency. The second thing that came out in later conversations was what Del told me about the Friday night vocalization, the 2-voice call and response they had heard from the porch on the last evening of the contract. In the initial account, the details were what I've already told you. 2 voices, different directions. The first, the same sustained sound from 2 weeks earlier. The second, shorter and almost bark-like. But in a later conversation, Del told me something about the second sound that he hadn't included before. He said he'd stood on the porch listening after Cody went inside, listening until the cold made him go in too. And in those extra few minutes, he heard the second sound again, much fainter, further west, as if whatever was making it had moved since the first exchange. And this time, in the faintness and the distance, he heard something in the structure of the sound that made him go cold in a way the first hearing hadn't. He said, "It sounded like it was calling for something. Not the way animals call territorially, not a declaration. More like the sound a dog makes when it's separated from its person and looking for them. Something searching." He said he'd thought about that for 2 years, and he still didn't know what to do with it. If the vocalization on that last Friday night was 2 members of a pack communicating, and if one of those communications had the quality he was describing, then the wounded creature in the timber was already communicating with the others before Dell fired the shot the next morning. They'd known something was wrong with it. They'd known before the gun came out. I don't know how to fully account for that. I put it here because Dell said it was the detail he hadn't been able to share before, because it was the one that made the whole thing feel most like something he'd done to a family rather than to an animal. The third thing that came out later was about Dell's dogs, plural. He'd had 2 dogs before Puck over the years, a coonhound named Ruger he'd had for 7 years, who had died of cancer in 2015, and before that, a mixed-breed retriever named Jake who'd lived to 13. He told me that on the nights during the 6 weeks at the fence line, when Puck stood at the back door shaking, he'd thought about Ruger and Jake and what they would have done. Ruger had been a fearless dog, the kind that would tree a bear and hold it there. Jake had been calmer, but equally steady. Dell said he was fairly confident that either of those dogs would have been barking their heads off at a fence line with something large at it. Puck wasn't barking, he said. That was the thing that changed how I understood what was out there, not the size, not the tracks. The fact that my dog, who is not a nervous dog and who is not a quiet dog, would not make a sound. Because the only time I've seen Puck go that quiet is when he's in the presence of something he's fundamentally uncertain how to categorize, something that doesn't fit his understanding of the world. He knows what to do with bears. He knows what to do with people. He doesn't know what to do with whatever was at my fence, and he communicated that every night it was there by doing nothing except stand and shake. I've thought about that observation a lot. Animals that predators have been selectively hunting for millennia develop behavioral responses to those predators that are partly hardwired. A dog that's been bred for generations to hunt has those responses plus the modifications centuries of domestication have introduced. But an encounter with something that is outside the known predator taxonomy, something neither the dog's instincts nor its experience has a category for, produces a different response. Not fight and not flight, but a kind of paralysis of the behavioral system, the visible manifestation of a classification error. The system knows something is there, it can't determine what. The uncertainty itself is the threat. That's what Puck showed on every night something was at that fence. Classification failure. And what produces classification failure in an experienced working dog is not something ordinary. I want to tell you about the one additional thing I found on my 3rd visit to the Boston Mountains in the spring of 2023. Because it's the piece of physical evidence I carry around most completely, the one that made me decide to finally tell this story publicly after sitting on it for 2 years. I drove into the Boxley Valley on a clear morning in late April, the kind of Ozark spring morning that makes the whole country look new, green coming hard through the timber, the creek running high from snowmelt up in the Missouri Ozarks, coming down through the Buffalo system. I went first to the ranger station in Jasper and then drove out to the property. The landowner had sold the place in the fall of 2022. The new owners were a family from Texas who were using it as a hunting camp and had done some work on the cabin and cleared some brush, but hadn't changed the timber significantly. I knocked on the door, nobody home. I walked the boundary. The northwest corner was 4 years past the logging job. The regenerating growth from the disturbed timber sections had reached about 12 to 15 feet in places, young sassafras and dogwood and serviceberry filling in the gaps, the first canopy forming. The national forest timber on the other side of the boundary was unchanged, old growth, canopy at 60 feet, dim below. I went to the post oak where I'd found the marks in 2021. It's a large tree, 2.5 feet in diameter at the base, been there for at least a century. The marks from my 2021 visit were still visible, faded and weathered now. The exposed wood in the furrows darkened from 2 years of exposure. I put my hands on them, then I looked up. There were new marks. Above the 2021 marks, higher up the trunk, starting at about 11 feet and running to about 14 feet. 4 furrows, same grouping, same depth. The exposed wood inside them was pale. Pale in the way that only very recent damage is pale. The way a fresh cut looks before it oxidizes, before the air has had much time with it. These marks had been made within the last week, maybe less. I stood at that tree for a long time. April morning, birds working in the canopy above me, a pileated woodpecker hammering somewhere to the east, the creek audible in the hollow below. I looked at the new marks and the old marks and the bark between them and the space above them, where the trunk continued up into the lower canopy at about 20 feet. Whatever made those marks had reached to 11 feet off the ground. The marks from 2021 started at 9 feet. 2 feet higher. That's not the same individual making the same marks in the same place over time. That's a different individual, or the same individual at a different point in its growth, reaching higher. It occurred to me, standing at that tree, that I was looking at something like a growth record, the way you mark a child's height on a doorframe. The marks at 9 feet and the marks at 11 feet were not the same event. They were separated by 2 years, and they showed a measurable difference. Something in that forest was growing. Something young enough to be growing was using that tree as a marker, and it had been doing so across at least 2 years of my observation of it, and for who knows how long before I started paying attention. I photographed the new marks. I documented the height differential. I measured the new furrow depth with a steel rule and compared it to the 2021 photographs. The new marks were deeper, proportionally deeper in a way that's consistent with a larger, heavier animal making the same type of mark with more force. I walked back to the county road and drove to Jasper and sat in the parking lot of the coffee shop there for a long time before I went in. And what I sat with was not the strangeness of what I'd found. What I sat with was its ordinariness in a specific sense. Something was growing up in those mountains. Something young enough to be leaving measurably different marks 2 years apart was using that territory, which means the territory is occupied by a population that includes young individuals, which means the population is reproducing, which means what Cody and Dell encountered in 2019 was not an isolated relic animal in a dying range. It was a member of a functioning social group in an established territory that is continuing to exist and to grow. Whatever Dell put a .308 round into on that landing, it wasn't the last of anything. The pack is still there. It has young in it. And in the spring of 2023, one of those young was still marking that post oak at the northwest corner of a property that a logging crew worked for 3 weeks in the fall of 2019, and the marks it was leaving were 2 feet higher than the ones that had been there in 2021. I called Cody after that third visit and told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Higher marks." "Yes," I said. He said, "So it's young." "It appears so," I said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "That means it grew up knowing about that corner. Whatever happened there in 2019, whatever the pack knows about that landing and that crew, it's been passed down. The young one knows." I said, "I think that's right." He said, "Then they haven't forgotten us." I said, "No, I don't think they have." He said something then that I want to get exactly right, because I think it's the truest thing anyone said to me in 2 years of working on this story. He said, "I hope whoever buys that property next and wants to do timber work up there has better judgment than we did. Not because I'm afraid of what will happen to them, but because of what they might do to it. We were lucky. We were in that corner for 3 days and only 1 shot was fired and everyone walked out. The next crew might not be as restrained as Dell, and whatever's growing up in those mountains, whatever's making those marks at 11 feet now and will be making them higher in a few more years, it deserves better than to end up in a landing the way its pack member did." He paused. He said, "I've been in the woods all my life. I've taken timber from 1,000 acres of Ozark forest. I know what's in those hills. I thought I knew. Whatever is in the northwest corner of that property, I didn't know about it. None of the records knew about it. And now I know about it. And knowing about it means I have a responsibility toward it that I didn't have before." I asked him what that responsibility looked like in practice. He said, "For me, it means not going back, not contracting in that area, not talking about this in a way that sends other people in there to look for it. You're telling the story, and I agreed to let you tell it, and I think it's the right call because people should know what's in those mountains so they can behave accordingly. But I don't want this to become an invitation. I don't want the Boxley Valley to become a Dogman tourism destination. Whatever is in that northwest corner, and in the wilderness sections north of the Buffalo River, it needs that territory to stay quiet. It needs people to not go poking around in it at night with cameras and flashlights, and the specific combination of curiosity and poor judgment that gets people hurt. He said, "The arrangement we have with it right now, after what Dell did and what followed, is that it let us leave. It followed Dell home, and it made its presence known, and it stopped. That's a reasonable outcome, given what Dell did. But the arrangement isn't a treaty. It's not a guarantee. It's just what happened to be the result of a specific encounter under specific conditions. Different conditions might produce different results. I've thought about that framing a lot. The arrangement, not a peace treaty, not an agreement between parties who've negotiated terms. Just what resulted from what happened. A kind of dynamic equilibrium that holds as long as both sides stay in their respective territories and don't do anything to change the conditions. It held in 2019 because the pack let it hold. It held in the 6 weeks at Dell's fence line because the pack chose to mark and leave rather than escalate. And it holds now, in the spring of 2023, because nobody has gone back into that northwest corner and fired another shot. The day I leave it is the day I stop being confident about what holds. There's one more thing I want to tell you before I close this out. Something that came from the research rather than from Cody and Dell. Something I found in the historical record that I can't quite leave alone. The Elias Dunbar journal that I mentioned earlier, the 1873 hunting log from Franklin County, has more than one relevant entry. I mentioned the sandstone shelf entry, the track sketch, the comment about leaving at a faster pace. But there's a later entry from the following spring that I didn't include in the main account, because at the time, I wasn't sure what to do with it. The later entry is dated April of 1874, about 7 months after the sandstone shelf encounter. Dunbar is back in the same general area of the ridge, hunting turkey in the spring season. His entry describes following a bird through the hollow above the creek and finding himself, without quite meaning to, near the sandstone shelf where he'd found the tracks the previous fall. He writes that he stopped and did not go any closer. He writes that the shelf looked the same as before, the same kind of flat sandstone exposure, the same creek noise below, the same timber above. And then he writes something that made me go back and read the surrounding entries carefully to make sure I was reading it right. He writes that there were marks on the cliff face above the shelf, not like the tracks, different, long parallel grooves in the rock face, running vertically, starting at about the height of a man's head and going up. He writes that they were new, or seemed new, because he thought he would have noticed them the previous fall if they'd been there then. He writes, "I do not know what made these marks in the stone, but they have the look of something deliberate, and I came away again at a pace not suited to a man my age. Long parallel grooves in a rock face above a sandstone shelf, starting at about the height of a man's head, marks in stone, not bark, made in the winter or early spring of 1874, apparently after Dunbar's initial discovery in the fall of 1873, made in the place where Dunbar had found the tracks, made so he would see them if he came back. He came back and he saw them, and he left fast. Whatever left those marks in that rock face in the winter of 1873, 1874, knew that Dunbar had been at the sandstone shelf, knew that he'd taken the tracks, knew that he might return, and it left something for him to find when he did. That's 1874. That's 149 years before the post oak in the northwest corner of the Boxley property. And the pattern is identical. Marks in a material that records them, left in a place associated with a human encounter, left at a height that communicates the maker's physical scale, left so that when the person returns, they'll find them. Whatever is in those mountains has been doing this for at least a century and a half. By the written record, it has been watching, it has been marking, it has been acknowledging encounters and leaving evidence of its presence for those who come back. That's not animal behavior, that's a practice. Something maintained across generations, passed down within the group, a way of relating to the human presence that periodically moves through its territory. Think about what that means. Think about the patience of it. Think about a social group that has maintained a practice of territorial acknowledgement across at least 150 years of documented observation, and probably much longer than that. A group that watches, marks, communicates, responds proportionally to harm, and never, in any account across all those years, initiated an attack on a human who wasn't doing something to provoke a response. Whatever Dell shot on that landing, it chose to stand and take the shot. It didn't charge him, it didn't come through the door at his property in Rogers. It came to his fence line, and it marked the posts, and it waited, and it left. 6 weeks of presence and marking, and then silence. That's not what monsters do. Monsters don't grieve proportionally, and then stop. I don't know what to call what's in those mountains. The word Dogman is the closest English label, and it fits the physical description well enough, but it doesn't carry the weight of what the behavioral record implies. Dogman sounds like a cryptid, something from a list of unexplained things, filed under unusual alongside Bigfoot and Mothman and the rest of the catalog of things that people see and can't explain. What's in the Boston Mountains is older and more deliberate than that label suggests. It's something that has been watching the human presence in those hills since before there was a United States, since before the Osage established their territory, maybe since before the bluff dwellers chose their south-facing ledges and left the north-facing hollows alone. It is still there. It is still watching. It is growing, at least one young individual in the population, making marks at 11 feet that were at 9 feet 2 years ago. It remembered the landing in the northwest corner of the Boxley property in 2019, and whatever it passed on to the next generation includes that memory, because 4 years later, something young is still marking the tree at the corner where the shot was fired. They haven't forgotten, and that seems right to me. Forgetting seems like the wrong response to what happened. What happened deserves to be remembered by both sides as a lesson in what occurs when the human presence in those mountains makes itself difficult to ignore. Dell didn't go into the forest looking for trouble. He went to do a job. The trouble found him in the form of a pair of headlights sweeping across a landing and an animal that had been watching for 2 weeks stepping out of the timber at the wrong moment. A reaction that was understandable and that cannot be undone. The marks on the post oak are still there. The marks Dunbar found in the cliff face above the sandstone shelf are probably still there, if anyone were to look for them, weathered by a century and a half. But stone holds marks longer than bark holds marks. And somewhere north of the Boxley Valley, in the dense timber above the Buffalo River, in the hollow systems that run up toward the Richland Creek Wilderness and the Upper Buffalo Wilderness, something is moving through that country the way it has moved through it for longer than any record we have. It is watching the valley below. It is watching the road. It is watching whoever drove into this country today and will watch whoever drives out. And it is patient in a way that we are not, and it has time in a way that we don't. And it will be there long after the next logging contract and the next hunting season and the next generation of birders coming to photograph whooping cranes in the Boxley Valley bottomland. The Boston Mountains keep their own time. We move through them as guests, whether we understand that or not. In October of 2019, 2 loggers didn't understand it. By the time they drove out of Newton County on a Saturday morning with a feller buncher on a lowboy and a dog that wouldn't look out the window, they understood it in a way that can't be taught by anything less than what they went through. I hope the understanding is enough to keep what happened on that landing from happening again. I'm not confident it is, but I hope. I want to go back to something Cody said in one of our middle conversations. Not the first one and not the last one. One of the conversations in between where we were just talking, rather than conducting an interview. He said something that I've been turning over ever since, and that I think is the most useful thing anyone said to me in all of this. He said, "You know what I keep coming back to? The first day I walked the property. Before the contract started, before the equipment went in. I walked the northwest corner, and the birds were gone, and the deer sign was pulled south. And I said to Dell, maybe there's a cat. And I said, yeah, maybe a cat. And then I moved on. I filed it as an anomaly and let the work brain take over and stop paying attention to it." He said, "I've thought a lot about what would have happened if I'd paid more attention to it. If I'd gone back to the landowner and said, look, something's wrong in the northwest corner, I don't know what it is, but the wildlife is displaced in a way I can't account for, and I'm not comfortable working that section until I understand it better." That's not an unreasonable thing to say. I've said similar things on other jobs when the terrain wasn't what the contract described or the access was unsafe. The landowner could have told me to walk away, or he could have told me what he knew, if he knew anything. He said, I don't know if he knew anything. I never asked. I never asked because I filed it as an anomaly and let the work brain take over. And the work brain doesn't ask questions about anomalies. It solves them by moving forward. That's what it's designed to do. That's what makes it useful in a timber operation. And in this case, that's what got us to a Saturday morning on a landing in the northwest corner with a creature 40 feet away and Dell's hand on a rifle. He said, "The lesson I took out of that isn't that there are things in the forest I can't explain. I already knew that. The lesson I took out of it is that when the environment tells you something is wrong in a way you can't account for, you have an obligation to listen to it before you decide it doesn't apply to you." I've thought about that as a broader statement about how people move through wild places. The birds know, the deer know, the dog knows before the people do, and the dog starts telling you on day 13 when it stops eating and lies on the porch watching the tree line. The environment has a system of signs that pre-exist human presence, and that human presence, if it's paying attention, can read. We've just gotten very good at not paying attention. We've built a work brain, as Cody calls it, a way of processing the environment that filters out the things that aren't directly relevant to the task at hand. And mostly that's adaptive. It's what lets us function in complex environments without being overwhelmed. But in the northwest corner of a property in Newton County, Arkansas, in the fall of 2019, it was the thing that kept Cody from doing what a more attentive version of himself might have done, which was say to Dell, "Something in this corner is wrong in a way I can't explain, and I want to understand it before we go further." That conversation didn't happen. The work brain filtered out the anomaly, and they kept working. And 3 weeks later, a shot was fired on a landing. I don't know what the right framework is for the country north of the Buffalo River. I don't know what protocol should govern how people move through those wilderness sections and that adjacent private land. I don't know whether the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission or the Forest Service or any other agency with jurisdiction in the Ozark National Forest has any institutional awareness of what the evidence suggests is present in those wilderness areas. And if they do, I don't know what they do with that awareness. The retired ranger who told me about the 6 reports he'd logged over 20 years was cautious in how he described his institutional response. He logged them as unverified wildlife encounters. He said he'd never been able to match them to a documented species. He didn't say anything about whether that mismatch prompted any further action. I asked him directly, "In your 20 years in the Ozark National Forest, did you ever receive guidance from above about how to handle reports that didn't fit the known taxonomy?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I received guidance about how to document unusual wildlife reports and how to file them. The guidance didn't address what to do if the reports continued to come from the same areas over many years and continued to describe the same thing and continued to fail to match any documented species. I asked, 'What did you do with that gap?' He said, 'I filed the reports and moved on to the next thing. There are a lot of things to do in 20 years in the National Forest. You can't spend your career investigating reports that don't have physical evidence.' He paused. He said, 'But they're there. The files are there. If someone with institutional authority ever decided to take them seriously and look at them systematically, the pattern would be visible. The same areas, the same description, the same behavioral profile over 20 years. The pattern is there.' I think that's true of a lot of the documentary record I've described in this account. The Dunbar Journal is in the University of Arkansas Special Collections. The Hess and Birdsong letters are in the Franklin County Historical Society archives. The 6 reports from the Forest District are presumably somewhere in Forest Service records. The trail camera images from Dell's property exist and have been analyzed by 2 independent professionals. The marks on the post oak at the Boxley property exist and are photographically documented. The pattern is there for anyone who wants to assemble it. What's missing is institutional will to assemble it, and the kind of unambiguous physical evidence that would make the assembly impossible to dismiss. A body or a clear photograph taken in controlled conditions, or a sample that could be analyzed genetically. None of those things exist in this case. What exists is testimony from 2 credible witnesses, documentary records spanning 150 years, photographic evidence from trail cameras that 2 independent analysts have confirmed as unmanipulated, and marks on trees and fence posts that are consistent across locations and times in a way that's difficult to attribute to coincidence. That's enough for me. I've spent 2 years with this material, and I'm persuaded by the preponderance of it. But I recognize that Persuasion isn't proof, and I'm not presenting this as proof. I'm presenting it as the fullest account I can give of what two loggers experienced in October 2019 in the Boston Mountains, what followed them home, what I found when I went looking for historical context, and what I found when I went back to that property 3 times over 2 years. You make of it what you make of it. What I'll say in closing is something simpler than any of the analysis. The Boston Mountains are real. The Ozark National Forest is real. The Richland Creek Wilderness and the Upper Buffalo Wilderness are real places where real people go and from which real people have returned with accounts they can't explain. The University of Arkansas Special Collections has a hunting journal from 1873 with a track sketch in the margin that matches photographs taken in 2019. These things are checkable. The specific locations I've named are on maps. The archives I've described are accessible to researchers. I'm not asking you to take anything on faith. I'm asking you to follow the threads if you want to know what they lead to. What they lead to, in my experience, is a mountain country that is older and more occupied than most people who drive through it on Highway 21 understand. A country that has its own inhabitants with their own protocols and their own memory and their own continuity across time, spans that dwarf any human presence in the Ozarks. A country that is, in the specific sense Cody described, watching. It watched Elias Dunbar walk away from a sandstone shelf in 1873. It left marks on the cliff face above that shelf in the winter that followed, marks for him to find when he came back in the spring. He found them. He left fast. It watched the bluff dwellers occupy the south-facing ledges for 4,000 years and leave the north-facing hollows alone. They left the north-facing hollows alone. The empty hollow country is still there, visible on any vegetation map of the area. The unexplained gap in ancient occupation in exactly the terrain where the encounter record concentrates. It watched Cody Farr and Del Farr work 400 acres of private timber for 3 weeks in October 2019. It came to the cabin, clearing 60 yards away on the last Friday night. On the last Saturday morning, it stepped out of the timber at the southeast corner of the landing and stood in the open and was seen. And when the headlights came and the rifle came out, it made a choice. That choice and what followed from it is the reason I've spent 2 years on this story. Not because the shot was fired, because of everything the shot revealed about what's in those mountains. The intelligence of what stood there and took it. The organizational capacity of what came to Del's fence line afterward. The growth record on the post oak that tells you the population is intact and continuing. The spring marks at 11 feet that tell you whatever is growing up in those mountains is growing up knowing about the landing at the northwest corner of that Boxley Valley property. They know, they remember, and they are still there. The Boston Mountains are open to the public. The national forest trails are maintained, at least the designated ones. People hike the wilderness sections, hunt the adjacent private land in deer season, float the Buffalo River every spring and summer and fall. Most of them come and go without incident. Most of them see nothing unusual. The country is big and the wilderness is genuine, and the population of whatever is in the deep timber sections is presumably small, distributed across thousands of acres of terrain that most visitors never leave the trail system to enter. But if you go off trail into the north-facing hollow country above the Buffalo River corridor, especially in the areas bordering the Upper Buffalo Wilderness and the National Forest land running toward the Missouri line, pay attention to what the environment tells you before your work brain filters it out. If the birds go quiet in a section that should have bird activity, notice that. If the deer sign pulls away from a particular direction in otherwise good habitat, notice that. If your dog goes to the door and won't bark and won't leave and won't stop shaking, notice that too. And if you hear two voices answering each other from different points in the dark north of wherever you're standing, call and response. Sustained and directional, a sound your brain insists on trying to categorize as something known and keeps failing. Notice all of that. And then, whatever you do next, be more thoughtful about it than Del Farr was on a Saturday morning in October 2019. He's a good man. He made the decision anyone might make under those conditions. He's been living with it for 5 years now, and he'll be living with it for as long as he lives. The dog never went back to being the dog it was before those 3 weeks in Newton County. The property in Rogers sold because Del couldn't make himself comfortable there after the fence markings. The 2 conversations a week between cousins who've worked together for 6 years have never gone back to what they were. That's the cost of a decision made in a fraction of a second, on a landing in the dark, in bear country, when something 7 feet tall with amber eyes was standing 40 feet away and didn't move when the headlights found it. I'm not here to judge the decision. I'm here to tell the story as completely as I can so that whoever reads it or watches it or listens to it understands what the Boston Mountains contain and makes whatever decisions they make in that country. With that understanding in mind, the marks on the post oak are still there. The spring marks from 2023, higher than the ones from 2021, are still there. Whatever is making those marks is growing. The pack is intact. Cody is in Fayetteville. Dell is closer to town now, smaller lot, no timber on the back boundary, a different kind of quiet than the one he grew up with, but a quiet he can sleep inside. Puck is 11 years old. He still goes to the door sometimes, late at night, and stands there. Dell never checked whether there was anything outside on those nights. He decided a few years ago that he didn't need to know. That seems like the right call to me. Some things you've seen once are enough.